Donna Summer's only #1 hit on the Billboard Hot 100 wasn't a song she wrote. It wasn't even a song built for her voice in the first place. It was a 7-minute reworking of a Baroque pop ballad that critics had spent a decade treating as untouchable. And by the time Donna Summer was finished with it, that reputation didn't survive intact either. It remains, decades later, one of the strangest and least examined facts in her entire catalog, buried underneath songs far more commonly associated with her name. Most casual fans, asked to name her biggest hit, would likely reach for something else entirely, unaware that the actual answer sits quietly outside the songs she is best remembered for. The song was MacArthur Park, written by Jimmy Webb and first recorded by actor Richard Harris in 1968. By the mid-1970s, it had already become something close to a musical landmark, celebrated for its sprawling orchestral ambition, and treated by much of the music establishment as a serious, almost sacred piece of songwriting. It was not the kind of song artists casually reinterpreted, and it was certainly not the kind of song anyone expected to hear reborn as a disco record. Its reputation, by the time Donna Summer approached it, had calcified into something close to untouchable. Critics and radio programmers alike treated it as a serious artistic statement rather than ordinary pop fare, reserved for orchestras and dramatic vocal interpretation rather than dance floors. Its famously surreal lyrics about a cake left out in the rain had already become cultural shorthand for overwrought sincerity, mocked and revered in roughly equal measure across a decade of commentary. By 1978, Donna Summer was already one of the biggest names in music, but notably, she had never had a #1 hit on the Billboard Hot 100 despite a string of major disco successes. Love to Love You Baby and I Feel Love had made her a defining voice of the genre and a fixture of dance floors worldwide, yet the very top of the singles chart had remained, up to that point, just out of reach. For an artist of her stature, that gap was becoming increasingly conspicuous, and the pressure to finally close it was real, even if rarely stated outright in the press. Casablanca Records executives, according to those familiar with the label's internal thinking at the time, were acutely aware that a #1 single carried a symbolic weight beyond sales figures alone, one that could cement Donna Summer's status among the genre's most commercially dominant artists, rather than merely its most influential. It was into this moment that producer Giorgio Moroder and the Casablanca Records team proposed something unusual, taking MacArthur Park, reworking it into a sprawling disco medley, and handing it to Donna Summer as the centerpiece of a new album. The idea carried obvious risk. Jimmy Webb's original composition was revered in certain critical circles precisely because of its seriousness, its orchestral scale, and its refusal to behave like ordinary pop music. Turning it into a disco record risked being read not as reinvention, but as desecration, an insult to a song many considered beyond the reach of dance music entirely. Disco itself, at that moment, was still fighting for basic critical legitimacy, and attaching its sound to a song so closely associated with serious songwriting only raised the stakes of failure. Donna Summer, according to those close to the project, did not treat the decision lightly. She was aware that reinterpreting a song this closely associated with serious songwriting carried real reputational risk, particularly at a moment when disco itself was already fighting for legitimacy in the eyes of much of the music press and older generations of listeners. Choosing to cover MacArthur Park meant inviting comparison not just to Richard Harris's original recording, but to an entire critical framework that viewed disco as inherently less serious than the music it was reworking, according to those close to the sessions. She approached the material with genuine respect for Webb's original composition, rather than treating it as raw material to be flattened into a generic dance arrangement. The recording itself became an ambitious, sprawling production, stretching past 7 minutes and folding in additional musical movements beyond Webb's original structure, transforming a single song into something closer to a suite. It was an enormous creative gamble, executed at a scale few disco records of the era attempted. Moroder's production leaned fully into the song's theatrical scope rather than shrinking it down for radio convenience, betting that audiences would embrace the ambition rather than reject the length and unconventional structure entirely. Radio programmers, accustomed to 3-minute singles, had to make an unusual exception for a track running nearly 3 times that length, itself a sign of how seriously the label believed in the project. Casablanca ultimately released an edited version for radio, while preserving the full-length take for the album, a compromise letting the ambitious production reach airwaves without abandoning its theatrical scope. When MacArthur Park was released as a single in the fall of 1978, the reaction split cleanly along old lines. Some critics dismissed it as exactly the kind of disco excess they had long complained about, an unnecessary reworking of a song that in their view never needed reinvention. Others found the disco arrangement newly revealing, arguing that Donna Summer's vocal performance uncovered an emotional urgency in Webb's lyrics that the more restrained original recording had never fully accessed. The song, whatever else it was, refused to be ignored by either side of that divide. Music journalists covering disco's ongoing critical battles at the time seized on the record as evidence for whichever argument they already believed, treating it as either the genre's redemption or its final overreach, depending on which publication one happened to be reading. Commercially, the verdict arrived quickly and decisively. MacArthur Park climbed to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in November 1978, becoming Donna Summer's first and, notably, only single ever to reach that specific peak, despite a catalog full of songs that would go on to define disco's legacy far more visibly. The irony was not lost on those following her career closely. The song that finally delivered her a #1 hit was not one of her own compositions, but someone else's ballad, reimagined into something almost unrecognizable from its original form. Billboard's chart data from that November confirmed what Casablanca had been hoping for months. That ambition, not caution, was what finally pushed Donna Summer over the top of the singles chart. That irony deepened over the following years, as songs like Last Dance and Hot Stuff became far more closely associated with Donna Summer's identity as an artist, despite never reaching the very top of the Hot 100, the way MacArthur Park had. Radio programmers, retrospectives, and even her own live shows would eventually treat MacArthur Park as a somewhat unusual entry in her catalog, rather than its defining achievement, a strange historical footnote sitting quietly beside songs the public more readily associated with her name and image. Even Donna Summer herself, in later interviews, reportedly treated the song's chart-topping status with a kind of wry acknowledgement, aware of how unusual it was that her signature commercial peak belonged to someone else's composition. She continued performing the song throughout her career, by most accounts approaching it less as an obligation and more as a genuine showcase piece she took pride in delivering live. Jimmy Webb's own reaction to Donna Summer's version has been described, over the years, in more measured terms than the initial critical backlash might have suggested. Webb, by most accounts, came to view the disco reinterpretation less as a betrayal of his original composition and more as evidence of the song's unusual durability. A piece of songwriting flexible enough to survive a transformation into an entirely different genre and still find a mass audience willing to embrace it. That the song could hold up under such a radical reworking said something about its underlying structure that the original orchestral version alone had never fully proven. Webb has since spoken about the experience with a degree of genuine curiosity, treating Donna Summer's version less as a rival interpretation and more as proof that his songwriting could travel further than he had originally imagined. Looking back, the choice to reinterpret MacArthur Park reveals something important about the pressures facing even the most commercially successful disco artists of the era. Donna Summer did not need a #1 hit to prove her cultural relevance. By 1978, her influence on the genre was already unquestionable. But the absence of that specific chart achievement had become its own quiet pressure, one that pushed her toward a genuinely risky artistic choice rather than a safer, more predictable single drawn from her own established songwriting partnerships. That she reached the milestone through someone else's material rather than her own catalog only reinforces how unpredictable commercial success in the music industry has always been, regardless of an artist's talent or track record. In the decades since, MacArthur Park has remained one of the more curious entries in Donna Summer's catalog, overshadowed in popular memory by songs the public more readily associates with her legacy, yet historically significant, as the only moment her name and the #1 spot on the Hot 100 actually intersected. Music historians revisiting the moment have increasingly framed it not as an anomaly, but as a revealing case study in how far disco was willing to stretch existing material, and how much commercial reward was available to artists bold enough to risk critical backlash for genuine reinvention. Retrospective assessments of the era have grown notably more generous toward the record, treating it less as a controversial gimmick and more as an ambitious, genre-blurring achievement that deserved more critical credit than it received at the time. What makes this story worth revisiting is not simply the chart statistic itself, but what the choice required of Donna Summer at a moment when she had every reason to play it safe. She did not achieve her only #1 hit by doubling down on the sound that had already made her famous. She achieved it by taking someone else's revered, seemingly untouchable composition and proving decisively that disco could transform even the most serious source material into something the widest possible audience would still choose to embrace. Decades later, that 7-minute gamble remains one of the clearest examples of what made her career so enduring. Not caution, but a consistent willingness to risk failure in pursuit of something genuinely new.